In the vast, untamed landscape of the American West, there are some things you just don't try to control. The wild wind, the fierce river, and certain kinds of people. This is the story of a man who thought he knew it all, a rancher as rugged as the land itself, and the young woman they called Untamable, a girl no one could control. It's a tale of two broken souls, a dangerous bargain, and the quiet, powerful love that grew in the dust and the moonlight. Get ready to discover how an act of rescue changed not one life, but two, forever. Jeremiah Jem Coulter was a man of the land, his existence as predictable and solid as the ironwood fences he built. He ran a sprawling ranch in the high desert of Nevada, a place of red rock canyons and endless sky. His life was a routine of sunrises and sunsets, the smell of fresh hay, and the lowing of cattle. He was a man who understood order and had little patience for chaos. That's why the arrival of Elara Ellie Price was a disruption of seismic proportions. Ellie wasn't just a problem. She was a storm. She was the granddaughter of his nearest neighbor, an old prospector named Silas, who had recently passed away. Silas had left the girl to Jeremiah's care, a final wish that had come as a shock. Ellie was known throughout the small, dusty town of Redemption as the Untamable girl. She had been passed from family member to family member, a wild spirit no one could handle. She had a reputation for defiance and a fierce independence that bordered on outright rebellion. Now, she was Jeremiah's problem. When she arrived, she was a mess of tangled dark hair, torn clothes, and eyes that held the wildness of a desert wolf. She refused to speak, refused to eat at the table, and spent her nights staring at the moon from the porch, a silent challenge to his orderly world. Jeremiah's first instinct was to find a way out of the promise he'd made to Silas. He was a rancher, not a babysitter for a wayward girl. The town, filled with whispers and rumors, was watching. They were waiting for him to fail, to send her away just like all the others. The central problem was clear. Jeremiah couldn't tame her, and she wouldn't let herself be tamed. His ranch, a sanctuary of control and routine, was now a battleground of wills. The conflict was not just between them. It was also within Jeremiah himself. He had promised the dying man he would care for his granddaughter, but he was losing the battle. He felt a growing frustration, a sense of helplessness that he, a man who could command a herd of cattle with a single word, couldn't even get a teenage girl to eat a proper meal. He knew he had to do something, but every move he made seemed to push her further away. The story began not with a grand adventure, but with a quiet, tense standoff between two souls who both felt trapped in different ways. The tension between Jeremiah and Ellie was a palpable force, a silent storm brewing under the vast Nevada sky. His first attempts to reach her were a series of misfires. He tried firm discipline, laying out rules for her to follow, but she simply ignored him, her rebellion a passive, yet potent defiance. He tried kindness, leaving food outside her door and speaking to her in a soft voice, but she would just stare at him with those wild, unblinking eyes. The whispers from town began to grow louder. When he rode into Redemption for supplies, the townsfolk would look at him with a mix of pity and judgment. "He'll never tame her," Old Man Johnson, the blacksmith, grumbled as he hammered at an iron horseshoe. The local preacher, Brother Thomas, told him that a wild spirit could only be broken by prayer, a suggestion that grated on Jeremiah's practical sensibilities. Ellie's defiance wasn't just a mood. It was a deep-seated fear. She had been passed from house to house, treated like a problem to be solved, a possession to be controlled. She had learned early on that the only way to protect herself was to refuse to let anyone in. Her untamable nature was a shield, a wall she had built around her heart. Jeremiah, in his own way, was just as guarded. His quiet life on the ranch was his own fortress, protecting him from the kind of emotional attachments that had only brought him pain in the past. The first major challenge came in the form of a wild Mustang. It was a magnificent creature, a stallion with a coat the color of the desert at twilight, with a reputation for being completely unbreakable. A group of local ranchers had been trying for weeks to capture and tame it, and they had all failed. The stallion was a symbol of pure, unbridled freedom, a mirror to Ellie's spirit. One afternoon, Jeremiah saw Ellie out near the fences, her body still and focused. She wasn't looking at the cattle. She was watching the Mustang, which was running in the distance. He had never seen her so animated, so present. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw, fierce admiration. She seemed to understand the wildness in the horse in a way no one else did. Jeremiah watched as she slowly, deliberately, began to move toward the Mustang. She didn't approach it with a rope or a bridle. Instead, she just walked, her body language calm and open. The Mustang, which had spooked at the sight of any man, didn't run. It stopped and watched her. The silence between them was a kind of communication, a quiet understanding of two untamed things recognizing each other. The other ranchers laughed at Jeremiah. "She's just going to spook it, Coulter." "The girl's crazy," one of them said. But Jeremiah didn't laugh. He saw something in that moment, a quiet, unlooked-for connection. The challenge wasn't to tame Ellie or the horse. The challenge was to understand what it meant to be untamed. And as he watched Ellie, he realized that he too had been trying to tame something that wasn't meant to be broken. This realization was the first crack in his hard, protective shell. The unexpected twist in the story came not from a new character, but from a revelation about an old one. It was a hot, still afternoon, and Jeremiah was working in his barn when he found a small leather-bound journal hidden among Silas's old tools. It was Silas's journal, filled with neat, spidery handwriting. As he read it, a new picture of Ellie began to form, a picture that shattered his assumptions and brought him to his knees. The journal entries revealed that Silas hadn't just been an old prospector. He had been a man with a troubled past. He had once been a wealthy landowner back east, with a daughter who had been too wild for her time. She was a free-spirited artist who had refused to marry the man her father chose for her, and she had run away. Silas, in his younger, more rigid days, had cut her off completely. Years later, he had found her again, a young widow with a small daughter named Alara Ellie. He had taken them in, filled with regret for his past actions, but the damage was already done. Ellie's mother, worn down by a hard life, had passed away soon after. The entries revealed something more sinister. The families that had taken in Ellie weren't trying to help her. They were trying to break her. They were distant relatives, people with a sense of moral superiority who saw Ellie as wildness, as a flaw to be corrected, a spirit to be tamed through punishment and cruelty. Silas had written in his journal about how he had to rescue her multiple times from the very people he had entrusted her to. His last wish for Jeremiah to care for her was not just a request. It was a desperate plea to a man he knew was honest and just, someone who wouldn't try to break her. The revelation hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He had been so focused on his own frustration, his own sense of duty, that he had missed the truth of her pain. Her refusal to eat, her silence, her unblinking stare, it wasn't defiance. It was a quiet, profound resistance born of trauma. She wasn't untamable. She was simply unbreakable. She had learned that the only way to survive was to hold on to the fierce, wild heart that was hers and hers alone. Emotionally, this changed everything for Jeremiah. His frustration transformed into a protective fury. He felt a deep sense of shame for his own impatience and a powerful, raw anger at the people who had hurt her. The standoff was over. The conflict was no longer between him and Ellie, but between them and a past that had tried to steal her soul. His decisions from now on would be guided not by a sense of duty, but by a powerful, new-found purpose, to protect her at all costs. The ranch, once a place of solitude, was now a sanctuary, and he would defend it with his life. The discovery of Silas's journal changed the very fabric of Jeremir's world. The tension escalated from a silent standoff to a full-blown confrontation, not with Ellie, but with the shadows of her past. Now that Jeremir understood the true nature of her untamable spirit, he saw every moment of her resistance as an act of courageous survival. His motivation was no longer about fulfilling a promise, but about protecting a soul he was beginning to understand. His new purpose was tested almost immediately. A few days after reading the journal, a man named Bartholomew Finch rode onto his property. Finch was a distant cousin of Silas's, a man with a cruel smile and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He had a reputation for being a snake, a man who would exploit any weakness for his own gain. Finch claimed he had just heard of Silas passing and had come to collect his rightful heir, Ellie. Jeremir knew in an instant that Finch was one of the people who had abused Ellie. He could see it in the way Ellie tensed, her body becoming as rigid as a stone, and in the way Finch looked at her, not with concern, but with a predatory ownership. The confrontation was tense, a battle of wits and willpower. "The girl belongs with family," Finch said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I've come to take her to a proper home, where she can be cared for properly." Jeremir stood his ground, his hand resting on the holster of his pistol. "She's already in a proper home, Finch, and she's not going anywhere with you." The external conflict was clear. Jeremir was standing between Ellie and a man who represented her past trauma, but the internal struggle was just as intense. Jeremir, a man who had always prided himself on his self-control and detachment, was now filled with a simmering rage he hadn't felt since he was a young man. The thought of this man laying a hand on Ellie, of taking her back to a life of cruelty, was unbearable. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a protector, a role he hadn't sought but had embraced with a fierce loyalty. Finch, realizing he couldn't bully Jeremir, resorted to threats. He hinted at the influence he held in town, about the ways he could make Jeremir's life difficult, and how he could ruin his reputation. Jeremir didn't flinch. He knew he was taking a huge risk, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't care about his reputation. He only cared about the girl who was hiding in his cabin, a girl he was starting to see not as a problem, but as a person with a quiet, powerful heart. As Finch rode away, his face twisted in a sneer of defeat, Jeremir felt an immense sense of relief, but he knew the battle wasn't over. He looked back at his cabin, at the small figure of Ellie standing on the porch, watching him with a new look in her eyes. It was a look of cautious trust, of a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, this man was different. That look was all the motivation he needed. He had to protect her, not just from Finch, but from a world that had tried to break her. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension, a silent promise of a storm yet to come. Bartholomew Finch, a man used to getting what he wanted, wasn't going to give up easily. He returned with the sheriff of redemption, a man named Brody who was as corrupt as he was ambitious. Brody, having been paid off by Finch, delivered the news with a smirk. "Finch has papers, Jeremir. Legal documents proving he's the rightful guardian. You have to hand her over." Jeremir knew the papers were fake, a last-ditch attempt to gain control of Ellie. He had a choice to make: give in to the corrupt law and lose Ellie forever, or fight back and risk everything. He looked at Ellie, who was standing beside him, her face a mask of fear. This was the moment of truth, the climax where all the tension and emotion would come to a head. "I won't do it," Jeremir said, his voice as steady as a rock. "The papers are fake. This man is a liar and a scoundrel. He's not here to protect her. He's here to hurt her." The sheriff laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "That's a serious accusation, Jeremir. You're going to have to prove it." The atmosphere was electric, filled with a mixture of suspense and fury. This was it. The climax wasn't just about a physical fight. It was about a final, desperate act of emotional rescue. It wasn't about a man taming a girl. It was about a man seeing her wild spirit not as a flaw, but as her greatest strength. Suddenly, Ellie did something she hadn't done since she arrived. She spoke. Her voice, though quiet, was filled with a powerful emotion. "The papers are fake, Sheriff, and I know why he wants me." She looked at Finch, her eyes blazing with a courage Jeremiah had never seen before. "My grandfather told me that my mother left me a small fortune, a trust fund she hid away years ago for when I turned 18. Finch found out. He's been trying to get his hands on it ever since." The revelation was a stunning twist that cut through the tension like a knife. The sheriff, whose eyes had been filled with greed, now looked at Finch with suspicion. Finch, his face a mask of shock and defeat, spluttered in denial. The trust fund, the hidden fortune, was the true reason for his pursuit. It wasn't about guardianship. It was about greed. But the final, most crucial twist was yet to come. Ellie, still holding Jeremiah's hand, added, "My grandfather had a secret will. He left everything to me on the condition that I live with Jeremiah until I turn 18. It's not a legal document. It's a promise between an old man and an honest man." The sheriff, a man who understood a bargain when he saw one, looked at the papers and then at Finch. The truth was now out in the open. The confrontation was over. The physical fight had been averted, but the emotional battle had been won. The untamable girl, who had been silenced by trauma and fear, had finally found her voice. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, but she had also revealed the heart of the rancher who had rescued her. The climax was not a moment of violence, but a moment of profound emotional revelation. With the truth laid bare and Finch and the corrupt sheriff exposed, the story reached its conclusion, but not with a bang. It ended with a quiet, profound resolution. Finch was arrested, and the sheriff was dismissed from his duties. But for Jeremiah and Ellie, their journey had just begun. The conflicts had been resolved, but the real work of healing and rebuilding trust was what lay ahead. Ellie, having found her voice, began to heal. She started to eat at the table, to talk about her past, and to share her hopes for the future. She no longer saw Jeremiah as a jailer or a rescuer, but as a friend. She began to see his stoicism not as a sign of coldness, but as a sign of his deep, quiet strength. She started to help with the ranch, her wild, untamed energy now directed towards a purpose. She was no longer a storm. She was a force of nature. And Jeremiah, in turn, began to change as well. His world, once so orderly and predictable, was now filled with a beautiful, chaotic energy. He found himself laughing more, his quiet solitude replaced by the comfortable companionship of a girl who, for the first time in her life, was starting to feel safe. He had set out to rescue her, but in a quiet, unexpected way, she had rescued him. She had shown him that a life lived with a quiet, passionate heart was more fulfilling than a life lived alone. The final scene of the story was simple, yet deeply emotional. Jeremiah and Ellie were sitting on the porch as the sun set, the red and orange hues of the sky painting a breathtaking picture. Ellie, with a new sense of peace in her eyes, looked at Jeremiah. "I used to think being untamable was my curse," she said, her voice soft. "Now I know it's my strength. Thank you for not trying to break me." Jeremiah, a man of few words, just nodded. He didn't need to say anything. Their shared journey had spoken volumes. He had promised a dying man that he would care for his granddaughter, but he had done so much more. He had given her a safe place to be herself, a place where she could be wild and free without fear. And in return, she had given him something he had never thought he would have again, a reason to open his heart. The story didn't end with a wedding or a grand gesture. It ended with a quiet moment between two people who had found in each other a home. The message was simple. Some spirits aren't meant to be tamed. They are meant to be loved.